Watching the academic agent's latest abortion, entitled What Marx Got Right, I couldn't help but ask the question, is the academic agent even trying anymore? I was especially surprised at how bad academic agent's understanding of Marx was, given that he is something of an expert on Marxism.
And you said the theory was nonsense. When people say that a theory is nonsense and they don't know anything about the theory,
Jack,
that's just intellectual dishonesty.
No, it's not, because I have read.
So you do know what the theory is.
I have read all 3 fucking volumes of Capital.
No, you haven't.
Why
are you lying?
I have. I've written books on.
So tell me.
Okay.
Tell me if you've read all 3 volumes of Capital, right? Tell me what CV and S stand for.
Jack.
Tell me what CV and S stand for if you've read all 3 volumes of Capital. What do those initials mean in the labor theory of value?
Jack, please.
You're a liar. Now, why would you lie?
Jack, I want you.
You don't even know. You've never read the fucking book.
I have read the book. Okay.
What does CV and S mean? What does CV and S mean?
I can't bloody remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, you can't remember. So you don't fucking know what the theory is. But okay? The point is, if you're going to say the theory is false, you have to provide an argument that the theory is false.
Despite his apparent depth of knowledge on Marxism, the thesis of this moronic video is that
Karl Marx made 2 predictions. First, that there would be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and second, that the people would rise up and seize ownership of the means of production from the capitalist bourgeoisie.
According to the academic agent, both of these predictions have in fact come true. That's right. There has been a global revolution of the proletariat. The means of production have been seized. You just didn't notice it.
Now, although it did not happen in the manner that he suggested, both of these predictions have largely come true.
This, according to the academic agent, means that the managerial class, what Marx called unproductive labour, is administering capitalism on behalf of the proletariat.
To help make this more concrete, let us take the example of McDonald's. This is owned by a great many shareholders. As you can see, some of the biggest ones are massive asset management firms such as the Vanguard Group and BlackRock, as well as some investment banks like Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan. It is also owned by various index funds and the US government pension fund. Now, who are all these investors? You're probably thinking of Ted Turner or Bill Gates, and who knows, maybe they are among the investors. But a huge portion of the money will come from average people, firemen, policemen, teachers, and so on. Their pensions, their savings accounts, their ISAs, their mortgages, all of them will be represented somewhere in here. So in effect, the people own McDonald's. Now you might be thinking, yeah, well, but what about those huge investors like BlackRock or JP Morgan who own a big chunk of the company? But look, BlackRock have the same owners. Look at the names. The Vanguard Group, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and then the index funds and the pension funds and so on. So how about JP Morgan? Well, it's the same story. Look, the Vanguard Group, BlackRock, Northern Trust again and again, and then the index funds, the pension funds, and so on. So who are this Vanguard Group that you keep on seeing then, you might be thinking? Well, the Vanguard Group is wholly owned by its clients, which is to say that if they manage your asset, you are a part shareholder. And whose assets are they managing? Well, yet again, it's the pension funds and mortgages and savings accounts of aforementioned firemen, policemen, teachers, and so on. And so we see that McDonald's, BlackRock, JP Morgan, the Vanguard Group, and quote-unquote we the people are one and the same. The distinction between the so-called capitalist class and the proletariat has somewhat broken down, although the managerial class still hold the reins of power in each organization.
Now, the academic agent fails for a number of reasons. Firstly, When he claims the people own the corporations, the people are not the shareholders of the chief instruments of capitalism. Some people are. And the tendency is not, in fact, towards greater ownership by ordinary people, but more concentration in the hands of the wealthiest. According to a report by Common Ownership, recent decades have seen a rapid and little discussed transformation in corporate ownership structure, with vital consequences for company behaviour and inequality. The percentage of UK listed shares owned by UK individuals has fallen to 12%, with ownership concentrated among the wealthiest. UK pension institutions own just 3% of total equity. By contrast, over half is now owned by overseas investors. Though many UK citizens are indirect shareholders through savings, distant financial institutions monopolise control rights, often exercising them directly against the interests of ordinary savers and workers. This is a very different picture from the one painted by the academic agent, almost the complete opposite in fact. But then, reality rarely conforms to libertarian fantasies. But what about the United States? According to a 2017 report titled Household Wealth Trends in the United States 1962 to 2016, Has Middle Class Wealth Recovered? Edward Wolfe writes, despite the fact that almost half of all households own stock shares either directly or indirectly through mutual funds, trusts, or various pension accounts, the richest 10% of households controlled 84% of the total value of these stocks in 2016. The report shows that the trend in the US mirrors the trend in the UK, with stock ownership becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of the elite. That 84% ownership, which accounts for individual shares as well as stocks held via mutual funds, represents a big change from 2001, when the top 10% owned just 77% of all stocks. Furthermore, while virtually all, that is 94% of the very rich reported having significant stock holdings, as defined as $10,000 or more in shares, only 27% of the middle class did. The study framed the middle class as the group between the poorest 20% and richest 20% of Americans. Furthermore, the concentration of stock holdings among the rich, Wolfe writes, is due to the twin stock market bursts of 2001 and 2008. While the middle class was scared off by these declines, he explains, wealthier investors were able to swoop in and increase their holdings. This doesn't sound like a dictatorship of the proletariat, does it? Now, as well as claiming that corporations are owned by the proletariat, the academic agent makes an equally preposterous claim that the fact that corporations are owned by the public means that the public thereby controls them, and that this form of control is effectively the same as if the means of control were collectively owned in the way Marx actually envisioned. This is obviously false. Even if everyone did own shares in private companies, which they don't, collective ownership of the means of production is obviously not the same as everyone in society having some share of capitalist enterprises. In the latter case, each enterprise is still working for a return for its shareholders, something which may well benefit those shareholders relatively, while at the same time harming the collective. To supplement his incredible knowledge of Marxism, academic agent would do well to read a book titled The Shareholder Value Myth by Lynn Stout. This book includes many examples which capture this conflict between capital serving the interests of shareholders and not harming the interests of other stakeholders who do not have a financial investment in the enterprise. Not only that, but the logic of the kind of shareholder capitalism which supposedly is effectively communism means that often the interests of the shareholders themselves are in conflict with the profit seeking of the enterprise they're invested in. She writes, a software company like Microsoft or Oracle might increase profits by buying out or destroying its rivals, thus gaining monopoly power that allows it to raise the price of its products. Unfortunately, if its shareholders are also software consumers, Those monopoly profits come from the shareholders' pockets. A Verizon or Hewlett-Packard might raise its share price by cutting employee wages or health benefits, or simply cutting employees. But when American companies embrace this approach en masse, American investors, who are also employees, suffer. GE may lobby for legal loopholes to avoid paying corporate taxes, but when corporations pay no taxes, humans must either pay more taxes or go without government services. And what of academic agent pointing out that even investment management funds like BlackRock are publicly owned? Once again, the idea that middle-class investors have any control of these kinds of investment funds, or that these funds will necessarily serve their shareholders' interests, is mistaken. Stout explains it thus. The lack of information and rational apathy that makes individual investors poor guardians of their universal portfolios also makes the beneficiaries of pension and mutual funds poor judges of whether their portfolio managers are doing a good job stewarding their universal interests. Just as retail investors default to the cheap, easy strategy of judging corporate performance by whether share price went up or down yesterday, pension and mutual fund beneficiaries judge the performance of fund managers according to whether the value of the fund portfolio went up or down yesterday. She continues, fund managers have little to lose and much to gain from supporting corporate strategies that raise the stock prices of the firms they hold in their portfolios, even when those same strategies harm their beneficiaries' outside interests. We should not be surprised to see a pension fund manager invest in corporations that cut costs by outsourcing jobs to China and India, even if many of the jobs that are outsourced belong to the employees contributing to the pension fund. And this highlights the real absurdity of this abomination. The academic agent makes the astounding claim that the managerial elite is working on behalf of the masses. That the decisions the managerial elite takes are actually the expression of a democratic will.
And so it should be clear that the government, the corporations, and the media are all wings of the same dictatorship of the proletariat, wholly owned by quote-unquote we the people, but wholly operated by the managerial class. And who are they? Well, like so many revolutionary commissars repeating their slogans over and over. We believe in democracy and equality. We believe in democracy and equality. Diversity is our strength. Diversity is our strength. Debt is money we owe ourselves. Debt is money we owe ourselves. And if Karl Marx could see all this, he'd be laughing his sick ass off.
This should be immediately absurd to anyone that observes the course of the West in recent decades, but can easily be empirically refuted too. For example, whenever polling is done on attitudes to immigration into Western countries, there is a consistent trend of a majority totally opposed to an increase in immigration. A great many people express attitudes to immigration that are excluded from the public space and are scarcely reflected in politics. This has been the case since the Second World War. Yet the actions of politicians and the managerial class has been in completely the opposite direction. Britons are now forecast to become a minority in their country by the mid-2060s, yet when polled recently in the We Were Never Asked survey, less than 5% of those polled thought that was a positive change, and over 65% thought it was a bad thing. Bear in mind that, according to the academic agent, the state, corporate power, and the people are in fact one. Strange then how little these attitudes are reflected in politics, or by corporate power for that matter. Now, there are ample number of examples I could also give of big business pushing mass immigration and other policies at the expense of their workers and the society they operate in. But let's take a very recent example. Recently, executives for Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Bank of America, BNP Paribas, Barclays and SunTrust have said they will no longer provide depository services to federal contractors with ICE for no other reason than their opposition to national immigration law. These 6 banks alone control over $7 trillion in combined assets. But wait, all of these banks are public companies. They're all owned by the people, with the managerial elite operating them in the interests of the democratic will. What percentage of the American population, or the shareholders of these banks for that matter, do you think would support withdrawing services for Americans who work for ICE? It is apparent to everyone but the academic agent, apparently, that finance capital again and again behaves against the will of the majority. Now, I think by now it should be apparent to anyone why the academic agent's arguments are ridiculous. But one other important point comes out of all this. In the early 1980s, inspired by fallacious arguments by libertarians like Milton Friedman, economists started to believe that a company's only goal should be to maximise the wealth of its shareholders, who would then pour money back into the economy as investments. During this time, laws and institutions were radically overhauled to make this happen. One especially crucial change occurred in 1982 when the Securities and Exchange Commission made it legal for firms to buy back company shares, giving more money to investors and allowing corporate boards to prop up stock prices. In the UK too, Margaret Thatcher, apparently a Marxist-Leninist by the academic agent's logic, oversaw the UK's own shareholder revolution, determined to turn the UK into a nation of small capitalists. As already discussed, in the long run this has led to a massive transfer of wealth to the elite. It also led to the maximising of short-term profits for the quick benefit of shareholders over long-term growth strategies such as better research and development, better products, and more productivity generally. In other words, things that would be good for the society at large, a society in which there was actually some form of collective ownership of the means of production might find preferable. The notion of shareholder primacy also helped to offload managerial responsibility. An amorphous and often anonymous shareholder pressure became the explanation for all manner of managerial malpractice. Managers lamented the fact that they had no choice but to disregard workers and other stakeholders because of shareholder power. Rhetorically, shareholders were deemed responsible for corporate problems, yet in practice managers more often than not enrolled shareholders in their own projects, using the newly formed alliance with shareholders to pocket huge returns for themselves. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, despite his incredible familiarity with Marx, the academic agent still doesn't understand what Marx means by the proletariat. He conflates it with the people generally, but the category proletariat for Marx is a subdivision of the people as a whole. Furthermore, Marx is largely carrying on a classical mode of political thought by emphasizing the capacity for free action as a necessary ingredient in human flourishing. By making one class representative of another, academic agent robs the underclass of its social and political existence and completely fails to understand Marx's motivation here. He wants these people to have the ability to actualize themselves as human beings instead of being reduced to what would be classically understood as a slavish existence, spending their entire lives labouring so that someone else can flourish at their expense. The irony is that this is precisely where both liberals, libertarians and Marxists overlap. All are guilty of fetishizing, for better or worse, a late Athenian concept of political freedom and virtue as identical with the human good, and this fetishization is in error. But it would be difficult to find someone who finds it entirely devoid of some truth. By his ignorant abuse of the relevant terms, the academic agent doesn't only misrepresent Marx's thought, he buries whatever value there was to be found in those traditions of thought which he superficially endorses. For all his faults, Karl Marx possessed infinitely more intellectual rigour and respect for his audience than this academic does.